How many teenagers and kids in the United States are actually in therapy? All right. Because it seemed to me sometimes like maybe it's just like a very particular group of people, like usually like privileged people, right? That end up getting maybe lots of therapy that they don't need.
Right. It's a brilliant question. It's an important one. So, am I just talking about rich kids problem? They're the Upper West Side. They're all throwing their kids into therapy, but the rest of America isn't. Well, when I started the book, I thought that the problem. I had a different hypothesis that I sold to the publisher, which was that it had something to do with the way kids were being raised today by their parents. But then when I started going into the mental health interventions to see what we were doing to help kids, I started realizing that we were really dumping therapy into the drinking water, by which I mean, look, nearly 40% of the rising generation says it's been in therapy. And I think the number is higher now, has been in some kind of therapy. And the reason I think it's even higher is because we're seeing extraordinarily high rates of kids responding that they've had a diagnosis. So somebody is diagnosing huge numbers of these kids. When you look at the different diagnoses, these vary, but as early as 2016, 1 in 6 American kids between the ages of 2 and 8 already had a mental health or behavioral diagnosis. So you're seeing these extraordinarily high rates of diagnosis. But you also, when you go into the schools, and this is public school, you see that not only have mental health staffs expanded in the last 15 years greatly, but they're all doing this sort of social emotional learning, which looks a lot like group therapy. It's kids sitting around talking about how they would handle various kinds of sadness, disappointment, struggle, and reflecting on their own. You saw that in the last generation, certainly all the best-selling parenting books, or a great many of them, were written by therapists. And they sort of instruct parents in becoming like, proxy therapists. And so I started realizing, look, some of this was from actual therapists, but a lot of people were behaving like therapists with our kids and introducing similar concepts of affirming the kid's feelings, never being judgmental, meeting a kid where they are, which means at eye level, never asserting their own authority, but just trying to understand every bit of, bad behavior as a cry for emotional help. And once I realized everyone seemed to be behaving like a therapist with the kids, I realized that the problem was much broader than parents. And it seemed to be that mental health so-called experts were really calling the shots, and all sorts of people from teachers to parents were really being to pediatricians were really being guided by the mental health industry.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the really crucial. Like, even if you're not and you're of a less privileged background, but you're in a public school context, you have a whole sort of public school system now, yes, and in conjunction with pediatrics, that is certainly for boys, very quick to label ADHD, very quick to prescribe Ritalin or Adderall. And those are, you can actually look at those numbers as just the hockey stick of that. So that's kind of observable even whether or not someone's in a talk therapy regime, right?
Yeah, and we were losing something in the process too, right? Every adult who had so-called undiagnosed ADHD was now saying, I probably had ADHD and it was never diagnosed. And no one was mentioning the fact that those adults sometimes were wildly successful as undiagnosed ADHD adults, right? So in many cases, it hadn't necessarily clearly hurt them to not be diagnosed. Nonetheless, we were letting kindergarten teachers decide that their 5-year-old boy really should be screened for ADHD. And I was talking to parents who were saying, one year a teacher said he had ADHD, and then the next year nobody said a word. He was suddenly a great student, and part of it was a different teacher. And going in and putting a kid, and I'm not saying nobody has ADHD, of course, but putting a kid on a dramatically personality altering drug. And here's the kicker: a kid, meaning someone whose entire being is necessarily in flux, was a way more serious intervention than I think we were treating it like. Rather than having our default be, well, let's see how he is. Let's make some changes in the environment and see how he does. The default was a good, responsible parent immediately gets the diagnosis and proceeds with medication.
This question of does a diagnosis help or hinder is such an interesting one. My partner has ADHD, and I think that he would very much so agree with you that, like, he always says, I hate it when people use their ADHD as a crutch, right? Like, it's anathema to him, on the other hand, how I grew up was there was a lot of undiagnosed mental illness around me. And when the mental illness was finally diagnosed, it was a huge relief. That wasn't me, other people. There's a way for people to be therapized or treated or healed. Like some people really do need medication. And I'm not necessarily talking about a 5-year-old, but sometimes there really are things that need to be treated. So, I mean, how do we, I guess, make sure that when something needs to be treated, it is being treated, but we don't end up treating people that it's not necessary to be treated?
Well, the most important thing is that the bar should be much higher for children. And the reason the bar should be higher for children, and I don't think it is, the adults get in there, they sort of all agree that this is necessary and they go, go, go. And here's the problem. You don't have anyone who can say, hold on a second. I remember how things were before the medication. I don't think this is right. I don't think this is working. I think I need an adjustment. You've taken the person out of the equation because it's a child or adolescent. And with an adult, it's so much safer to go ahead and give a medication a shot because they can tell you how they used to feel. And they can tell you, you know what? I don't have a sex drive now, and I don't like that. They can tell you, I'm really overeating. I'm concerned about that. I've put on a lot of weight. It's much harder for a teenager to evaluate those things because, of course, a young person is changing so rapidly. They're just developing a sex drive and getting a handle on it. So the number one most important thing is that it should be a higher bar for kids, and I don't think that it is. Right? It's just too easy for adults to sit around and all agree that the child needs medication without the young person having a meaningful part in the discussion because they can't. They really can't. An adult can say, look, a decade ago, I was doing much better and I wasn't on this medication and I think I can get back there. Anyway, but there's something else too. A person who gets a diagnosis will always feel relief, almost always feel relief. That is not proof that the diagnosis is accurate or that the medication is helping. And very often what it's doing is it's taking responsibility off the person. And we might want to do that for an adult for various reasons. And we might be willing to let that, err on the side of overdiagnosis with adult. But you don't want to take away, efficacy or responsibility or agency from a child who is just developing a sense of, wait a second, I was being lazy. If I'm being honest, I could have worked harder. If I'm being honest, I could have taken my math test. I kind of exaggerated. You don't want to relieve a kid of that responsibility unless you have to. Unless the problem is pronounced enough, you can say, look, I've been their parent. I can tell you those struggles with math are really serious or whatever it is. We need to do something.